Imagine a boy who has been told gently and on good authority, roughly how long he has to live. Not in the vague way we are all told it, as a fact about mortals in general, but specifically as a fact about himself, his own chest, his own narrowing future. The doctors who examined Karl Jaspers in his youth found a diseased and failing pair of lungs, and they did not expect the body around them to last. The estimates given to such a patient in those years were not generous. He grew up believing he would be gone by 30 or near it. He built his entire life on that belief. And the strange beauty of his story, the thing worth keeping in mind through everything that follows, is that the belief was wrong by half a century and more. He was born in 1883 in Oldenburg, a quiet town on the flat northern plain of Germany, not far from the cold grey reaches of the North Sea. It is a landscape without drama, low and level, and open to the wind, a country of fields and water and enormous skies. The people of that coast have a reputation, fairly or not, for being sober, plain-spoken, and unimpressed by grand gestures, and something of that temper stayed with Jaspers all his life. He distrusted enthusiasm, he distrusted noise. He preferred the patient thing said carefully to the brilliant thing said fast. That open country worked on him early. He loved the long horizon, the sea light, the wind moving unbroken across the fields, and he kept all his life a quiet hunger for wide spaces and for walking out under a large sky. Even in later years, when illness forced him to measure each step and each breath, the memory of that coast stayed in him as a kind of inner weather. He was not a boy of many friends. He gathered people slowly and let only a few of them all the way in, preferring a handful of deep and lasting attachments to the broad, easy acquaintance that came so readily to others. What he gave wholly, and what he kept for life. His family was solid and prosperous in the way of the northern merchant class. His father had trained in law and then moved into business, rising to become the director of a bank, a man of standing in the town. Yet for all that standing, the father was happiest out of doors, and he took the boy with him into the open country, teaching him to watch the weather and the water, and to be at ease in long silences. Behind the father stood generations of merchants and farmers, people rooted in trade and in the land, people who counted carefully and kept their word. His mother came from a local farming family of the same region, the same earth. The household was Protestant, but in the cool, undogmatic, liberal manner of the North German educated class. There was no piety in it, no fervour, no anxious watching of the soul. Religion was a matter of decency and inheritance rather than of trembling faith. The boy grew up without a creed pressed upon him, and he would spend much of his later thought trying to recover, on his own terms and by his own road, something the comfortable unbelief of his childhood had quietly set aside. Then came the illness, recognized in his teens, and after it, nothing was ever simple again. The diagnosis was a chronic disease of the lungs and the bronchial passages, a condition that in that era had no real cure and a grim expected course. Exertion could kill him. A fever could carry him off. He learned to read his own body as a patient reads a difficult instrument, alert to every change in pressure and breath. And so, while other young men were spending themselves freely, staying up through the night, throwing their strength about as though it were inexhaustible, Karl Jaspers learned to live as a man who could afford none of that. What he built, out of necessity, was a life of extraordinary discipline. Every day was measured. He worked in carefully limited stretches and then stopped deliberately before fatigue could turn dangerous. He rested for long hours, lay still, conserved. The day was built like a careful structure, each hour assigned its place. He worked in the morning while his strength was freshest, then lay down to rest before the work could cost him too much, then rose and worked again in measured portions. He avoided cold rooms and long stairs and crowded gatherings, anything that taxed the lungs or strained the nerves. His evenings were quiet and early. The rhythm almost never varied, year upon year, and that very sameness was part of what kept him alive and working. He refused the ordinary busyness that fills most lives, the rush of errands and obligations and small social duties, because he simply did not have the breath to spend on them. He rationed his effort the way a man crossing a desert rations water. And here lies the paradox that shaped him. A life lived under sentence of early death did not make him frantic or despairing. It made him deliberate. Because he could not assume tomorrow, he refused to waste today on what did not matter. The expectation of an early end taught him of all things how to live with attention. His studies began, as was proper for the son of such a father, with the law. He found it lifeless. The dry machinery of statutes and procedures, the manipulation of rules cut off from the human beings they governed, left him cold and restless, and he abandoned it. He turned instead to medicine, and there something answered him. Medicine reached toward the actual suffering body and the actual troubled mind, and he completed the long training and qualified as a physician. His early research already pointed where his deepest curiosity lay, toward the borderland between the body and the inner life. One of his first studies took up the strange and touching subject of homesickness and crime, the question of how a longing for home, that most ordinary of human aches, could in certain souls grow so unbearable that it drove them to terrible acts. From the beginning, then, he was drawn to the inner experience of a person, to what it actually feels like to be this one human being in distress. It was the old university town of Heidelberg that drew him in and held him. The place itself seemed made for a certain kind of mind, the river running below the wooded hills, the ruined castle standing above the rooftops, the narrow streets that had carried scholars for more than 5 centuries. He came there as a young physician and entered an atmosphere thick with talk and inquiry, and he never really left it, not for the whole of his working life in Germany. Something in him had begun to stir that medicine alone could not satisfy. He had set out to heal bodies and to understand troubled minds, but the questions kept widening under his hands until they were no longer medical at all. He found himself reaching past the clinic toward the largest matters a person can ask about: what a human being is, what truth is, what it means to live a life and to face its ending. And here his nearness to death did a quiet work in him. A man who has been told the year in which he will likely die does not in the end want cleverness from his thinking. He wants something sturdier. Jaspers came to ask of thought not that it dazzle or win arguments, but that it hold up, that it stand on its feet in the presence of a life lived under sentence. He had no use for brilliance that crumbled the moment real suffering touched it. He wanted a way of thinking a person could actually live by and could die by, and that demand, born at a sickbed in his youth, never left his work. In 1910 he married Gertrude Meyer, and this was perhaps the most important act of his life. She came from a Jewish family, and she was no decorative companion but an intellectually serious woman, searching and demanding in her own right, who became the true partner of his thinking. Their marriage was a long conversation that lasted as long as they both lived. He brought his ideas to her unfinished, and she met them with a mind as exacting as his own. She did more than think with him. She took the daily defense of his fragile strength into her own hands, learning the rhythm his body required and building the household around it. She guarded his hours of rest, turned away the visitors and obligations that would have drained him, sorted what deserved his limited energy from what did not, and kept the quiet he needed in order to work at all. Without that steady protection, it is hard to see how so frail a man could have done a fraction of what he did. Much of what he later wrote was possible only because she stood between him and the ordinary wear of the world. The bridge to her had been her brother, Ernst Mayr, who was Jaspers' dear friend, and through that friendship the two households were joined. In marrying into a Jewish family, a quiet and loving choice made in the ordinary hopeful spirit of 1910, Jaspers also bound his fate to theirs in a way that the coming decades would test with a cruelty no one in that year could have imagined. A second sentence of death, not against his lungs this time, but against the people he loved and against himself for loving them, was waiting far down the road. But that is for later. The shape of his working life can be set down here in the barest strokes. He began inside medicine, in a psychiatric clinic, looking closely at the mentally ill. From there he moved into the study of the mind more broadly, into psychology, asking larger and larger questions about how a human being can be understood at all. And from psychology he crossed, almost without meaning to, into philosophy itself, eventually holding a university chair in it, becoming a philosopher by vocation, though never quite by training. Late in his long life he would leave Germany altogether and live out his last years abroad. Each of these passages has its own weight and its own story. What matters first is the simple, astonishing fact at the root of it all. The frail young man who had been told to expect 30 years lived on, decade after decade, through the collapse of one Germany and the building of another, through war and catastrophe and exile, working steadily the whole time, the careful routine never abandoned, the rationed breath somehow holding. He outlasted his sentence by more than 50 years, and he did it not by ignoring death, but by keeping it always in view, an early death that never came, hovering at the edge of a life that, against every prediction, refused to end. In 1913, a young doctor in his early 30s, not yet 30 when he began, published a book called General Psychopathology, and with it he quietly changed how psychiatry understands a human being. He did not announce a revolution. He did not found a school or coin a slogan. He simply asked, with great patience, what it would mean to study the troubled mind honestly, and his answer reorganized the field beneath the feet of men who never noticed it shifting. The young doctor was Karl Jaspers, and he had come to the work by a strange road. His health was fragile from boyhood, and that frailty which belongs to the story of his life and which we have already met, shaped his vocation in a precise way. He could not sustain the ordinary grind of clinical practice, the long rounds, the night calls, the relentless physical labour of tending many bodies. So he settled at the psychiatric clinic in Heidelberg, working under the brain researcher Franz Niesel, a meticulous investigator of nerve tissue who stained and studied the cells of the brain under glass. Around such a man the assumption was natural. Mental illness was disease of an organ, and the organ was the brain, and the future of the field lay in the microscope. Jaspers respected that work, but he saw what it left out. A stain on a slide could show you a damaged cell. It could not show you what the patient was living through. And so, kept by his weak lungs from the bedside crush of practice, he turned instead toward research and toward method, toward the slow question of how the whole subject should even be approached. A medical publisher, looking for a textbook to organize a chaotic discipline, asked him to write one. He was about 30 when he sat down to it. What he produced was less a textbook than a quiet revolution in how to think. At the center of the book stands a distinction so simple it can be stated in a breath, and so deep that the discipline is still living inside it. There are two ways to make sense of what happens in a mind. One way is to explain. To explain is to trace causes in the manner of the natural sciences, to show how one event produces another by law, how a fever or a tumour or a chemical disturbance in the body issues in a symptom you can observe from outside. Explaining looks at the person as nature looks at any object, from the outside, asking what made this happen. It is the language of the brain researcher, and it is indispensable. The other way is to understand. To understand is to grasp from within how one state of mind grows meaningfully out of another, how the contents of a life hang together by an inner thread of sense. We understand that a man who has lost what he loved sinks into grief, and that the grief leads him to withdraw from the world, and that the withdrawal deepens into a silence that shuts the door on his friends. No microscope shows that chain. We follow it the way we follow a story, from inside the meaning, feeling how the second thing follows from the first, not by physical law, but by sense. A wound to the heart, a turning away. That connection is real, and it is knowledge, but it is knowledge of a wholly different kind from the knowledge of cells. Most of psychiatry before him had blurred these two together, dressing up guesses about meaning in the costume of physical cause, or else dismissing meaning entirely as unscientific. Jaspers held them apart with great care and insisted the field needed both. The scientist who explains and the interpreter who understands are not rivals. They are two hands, and a discipline that uses only one of them will fumble the human being it is trying to help. From that root grew the rest of the book. If understanding matters, then the first task is description, and description done with a discipline rarely demanded before. Before you theorize about a patient, Jaspers said, you must describe with exactness what that patient actually experiences from within. What does the voice the patient hears sound like to the patient? Where does it seem to come from? Does it feel like the patient's own thought, or like an intrusion from outside? You set aside for the moment every theory about what causes it, and you attend with discipline to the texture of the experience itself, as faithfully as you can render it. Only a clean description gives you something true to explain or to understand later. Theory imposed too early does not reveal the phenomenon, it buries it. And the patient, he insisted, is never merely a case. He saw the person as a whole human being with a history, a biography that runs from childhood through love and work and loss to the present hour. The illness is not a thing sitting apart from that history. It arises within a life and takes its particular colour from that life, and you cannot read the symptom rightly if you have torn it out of the story it belongs to. This biographical method, seeing the patient whole and in time, is the natural fruit of taking understanding seriously, for understanding is always the understanding of a life and not of an isolated moment. Then comes the most striking turn in the whole book, and it is a turn against the very method he had just built. For Jaspers found a limit to understanding, and he found it precisely in the most severe illness. We can follow the inner thread of meaning in ordinary grief, in fear, in jealousy, in despair, however dark these grow. But in the gravest disturbances, something appears that cannot be understood at all. The thread of sense simply breaks. A patient is seized by a conviction, or a transformation that does not grow out of anything in the life before it, that no story can reach, that stands there as a sheer unintelligible rupture. You cannot get inside it, and Jaspers saw that this very ununderstandability is itself the mark of real disease, the sign that distinguishes genuine illness from mere unhappiness. Sorrow, however terrible, still makes sense from within. The break that makes no sense from within is something else, and it is the deepest sign that a process in the organism has cut across the life of meaning. Here, at the wall where understanding fails, explanation must take over. The two methods do not merely coexist. They hand the work to each other at the exact point where one of them can go no further. Out of all this came a warning he returned to for the rest of his life, a warning against the pride of premature diagnosis. The neat label, the confident name pinned on a suffering stranger after an hour, the tidy category that closes the question before it has been opened, all of this he distrusted. A label can feel like understanding while actually replacing it, letting the doctor stop looking at the very moment he should look hardest. Real knowledge of a mind is slow, humble and provisional, and it must stay honest about how much remains dark. So the doctor who could not bear the ordinary labour of the ward became, by that very limitation, the one who taught the ward how to think. He did not choose between the scientist and the interpreter. He built the bridge between them and showed that the troubled human being can be approached from both shores at once, by the one who explains the body and the one who understands the life. That bridge is still standing. Much of what he wrote afterward, his whole long philosophy of the self and its limits, was already waiting in seed inside this first patient inquiry, in the simple refusal to mistake a person for an object. One living contemporary, more than any book he ever read, showed Jaspers what a human life lived at full intensity actually looked like. His name was Max Weber. We tend to meet our teachers on the page, in sentences composed by people we will never sit beside. Jaspers met his greatest teacher in a room, in the flesh, in conversation, in the slow accumulation of an acquaintance that became reverence. Weber was a sociologist and a scholar, a student of religion and economy and law, one of the towering minds of the German university world in the years before the First Great War. Jaspers came to know him in the intellectual life of Heidelberg, that old town on the river where the clinic stood and where the educated households kept their evenings open for talk. And what Jaspers found in Weber was not a doctrine to be copied, but a person to be witnessed. What did he witness? He witnessed a relentless intellectual honesty, a refusal to let any conclusion rest on comfort rather than evidence. He witnessed a mind that burned with passion and yet bound that passion to reason, that felt everything deeply and still insisted on seeing clearly. Weber would not allow himself the consolations that lesser thinkers grant themselves. He would not soften a hard truth because it hurt, and he would not pretend to a certainty he had not earned. There was something almost unbearable in the discipline of it. Here was a man held at full stretch, pulled taut between the demands of knowledge and the demands of life, torn by an inner tension he never resolved and never disguised. He suffered for it. He broke down under it for years at a time, and still he kept faith with the standard he had set himself, which was simply to live truthfully under pressure, to look at the world as it was and not as he wished it to be. For Jaspers this was a revelation, and it was a revelation of a particular kind. It taught him that human greatness is not a system and not a theory. Greatness is a way of being a person. It is a quality of conduct, a manner of holding oneself in the face of difficulty, an integrity that shows itself in how a man thinks and works and bears his own contradictions. Weber built no philosophy of existence. He left behind no architecture of the inner life, no map of the soul, no completed teaching about what a human being most truly is. And yet, by the sheer force of how he lived and how he thought, he became for Jaspers the living proof of a single decisive idea. The most important thing a human being can be is not something learned. It is something enacted. It is performed in a life, moment by moment, and it cannot be handed over in a lecture or stored in a book. Consider how strange and how freeing that thought is. We are accustomed to measuring wisdom by what a person knows, by the doctrines they can defend, by the volumes they have mastered. Weber unsettled that measure. His knowledge was vast, but his knowledge was not the point. The point was the bearing of the man behind the knowledge, the unbroken honesty with which he carried an almost impossible burden. Jaspers saw that you could absorb every argument Weber ever made and still miss the essential thing, because the essential thing was not in the arguments. It was in the person who made them, in the way that person refused every easy illusion and stood exposed to the full weight of what he saw. Then, in 1920, Max Weber died. He was not an old man. An illness took him quickly, and the loss fell on Jaspers like the loss of a father. Though Weber had been more than a father, more like a fixed point against which a younger man measures the whole of his own seriousness. Jaspers grieved deeply. He spoke in memory of his friend, and in that memorial tribute he tried to say what the man had been, not what the man had proved. He praised not a finished philosophy, but a finished life, or rather a life that had lived its incompleteness with a nobility that needed no completion. He set Weber before his listeners as an example, a measure, an image of what it meant to be wholly and unflinchingly human. And here, quietly, something turned in Jaspers himself. The young doctor had begun by describing the types of the human mind, the patterns into which inner lives arrange themselves, the careful catalogue of how people see the world. Weber pointed past all that. He pointed toward the single living self, the one who is not a type at all, the one who exists by choosing and enduring and standing fast. Slowly, Jaspers began to move from the study of humankind toward a philosophy centered on that exemplary, freely living person. He had seen in one man that the deepest thing in us is not what we have in common, but what we each must enact alone. The example walked beside him for the rest of his life, and it set the direction of everything he would later think. In 1919, Karl Jaspers published a book called Psychology of Worldviews, and although its title sounds like the work of a careful scientist sorting human attitudes into categories, it has often been called the first book of the new philosophy of existence. The idea it gave the world is simple to state and hard to live with. There are situations a human being can neither get around nor change. We do not solve them, outwit them, or pass through them to some easier country on the far side. We can only meet them. And the claim at the heart of the book is that meeting them honestly, without flinching and without disguise, is the place where a person first becomes real. Before he reaches those situations, Jaspers describes the way most of us spend most of our lives, which is to say, not facing them at all. He noticed that human beings build housings to live inside. A worldview, in his sense, is not merely a set of opinions. It is a shelter. It is a fixed picture of how things are, a doctrine, a tidy system that explains the world and assigns each thing its place, and we move into it the way we move into a warm house in winter. From inside such a shelter, life feels settled. The questions have answers, the future has a shape, the meaning of suffering and death has been filed away under headings that can be consulted but need never be felt. Jaspers did not despise these shelters. He understood that they give real comfort and that no one could endure the raw exposure of existence every waking hour, but he saw clearly what the comfort costs. The shell that protects us from reality also hides reality from us. We pay for the warmth with the truth. He used the image of a shell deliberately, the way a creature secretes a hard casing around its soft body. The casing keeps the body safe, and it also keeps the body from touching anything directly. A person can spend an entire life inside such a casing, busy, competent, even wise in a worldly way, and never once stand unprotected before the conditions that actually govern a human life. Most of the time, Jaspers thought, this is exactly what we do. We arrange our days so that the hard facts stay at the edge of vision. We fill the hours. We look away. And then there are the walls. Jaspers gave a name to the conditions we cannot escape or alter, the points where the ordinary scaffolding of life simply gives way and we strike something we cannot pass. He called them limit situations, the situations at the boundary of what we can manage or arrange. In an ordinary difficulty, there is always a move to make. If you are poor, you might grow richer. If you are ignorant, you might learn. If a road is blocked, you find another road. A limit situation is different in kind. It is not a problem inside life that life can solve. It is a feature of being human as such, a wall built into the structure of existence, and against it, every strategy fails. You cannot be clever about it. You can only be honest about it or not. He named several of these walls, and it is worth walking along each one slowly. The first is that we must die. Not that death is sad or distant or a subject for the funeral and the will, but that death belongs to you, that your own existence is finite and will end, and that no achievement and no love and no fortune alters this in the slightest. The second is that we must suffer. To be alive in a body exposed to time is to be open to pain, to loss, to illness, to the slow subtraction of the things we depend on, and no arrangement of life can seal that opening. The third is harder to admit. To live at all is to struggle, and often the struggle comes at the cost of others. We compete for room, for food, for love, for standing. Simply by taking up our place in the world, by feeding ourselves and protecting our own, we press against other lives. There is no perfectly clean way to be alive among other living things. The fourth wall follows from the third, and it is the one people resist most strenuously. We cannot avoid becoming entangled in guilt merely by acting and living. This is not the guilt of the criminal, which a later thinker, and Jaspers himself in later years, would examine in its own right. It is something more basic and more inescapable. Every choice excludes the choices not made. Every commitment leaves some duty unfulfilled, some person unhelped, some good thing undone. To act is to incur a debt that cannot be fully paid, and to refuse to act is itself an act that incurs its own debt. There is no posture, no caution, no purity of intention that keeps a living person entirely innocent. And the fifth wall is the unreliability of the world itself. We are at the mercy of chance. The accident, the coincidence, the stroke of luck, good or bad. The fact that so much of what shapes a life arrives unbidden and could as easily have arrived otherwise. We build on ground that can shift without warning, and no foresight makes the ground firm. Death, suffering, struggle, guilt, and chance. These are the five, and Jaspers insisted that they are not occasional misfortunes that happen to some unlucky people. They are permanent conditions of being human, present every moment, true of the contented as much as the wretched. The difference between people is never whether they stand before these walls. Everyone does. The difference is whether they know it. Now we can see why the protective shells matter so much to his argument. In ordinary life, we look away from these walls. We have to, in some measure, simply to function. We busy ourselves. We let the worldview do its work and hold the limit situations at arm's length, present but unfaced, like a sound in another room that we have trained ourselves not to hear. And for long stretches this works. The shell holds. But the walls do not go away because we have decorated the inside of the shell so pleasantly. They wait. What happens, Jaspers asked, when one of them can no longer be kept at the edge of vision? When the diagnosis arrives, when the person we cannot live without is gone, when an act we thought was innocent reveals the harm folded inside it, when chance reaches into a settled life and overturns it. In that moment the shell cracks, and for once we are standing in the open, exposed to a condition we can neither change nor flee. Most of his contemporaries treated such moments only as catastrophes to be survived and recovered from, episodes to get past on the way back to normal life. Jaspers saw something else in them. He saw an opening. For when a limit situation is met honestly, without the shell, it does something no comfortable hour can do. It strips away everything borrowed, everything we merely inherited or absorbed or wore as a costume, and it throws a person back on what is most truly their own. The roles fall off. The borrowed certainties go quiet. What remains is the bare fact of this single existence facing a condition that no one else can face on its behalf, that no system can explain away, that must simply be borne by this person and no other. And precisely there, Jaspers believed, In that exposure, a person is given the chance to stop being a creature of habit and evasion and to become a genuine self. He did not in this book lay out the full doctrine of what that self is, the self one can become, rather than merely the self one already is. That belongs further along the road. Here it is enough to say that the wall, faced without disguise, does not only crush, it can also wake. This is the strange reversal at the centre of psychology of worldviews, and it is why the young Heidegger read the book closely, and why so many who came after dated the new philosophy of existence from it. The very situations we spend our lives avoiding, the ones we build our shelters to keep out, turn out to be the only situations in which we can fully come to ourselves. The comfort of the shell is real, but it keeps us asleep. The shock of the wall is real, and it can wake us into our own existence. Jaspers was not recommending suffering, and he was not glorifying catastrophe. He was making a quieter and more unsettling observation. We do not become real in the easy hours when everything goes our way. We become real at the limits, in the places we cannot get around, when we finally stop looking away. Jaspers always insisted that he had ancestors rather than teachers, and the two he named most often were already dead before he began. One was a Dane, Søren Kierkegaard, who wrote in the first half of the 19th century and died young and obscure. The other was a German, Friedrich Nietzsche, who wrote in the second half of that century and collapsed into madness before it ended. Neither held a chair. Neither founded a school in his lifetime. Both wrote against the great confident systems of their age, against the philosophies that promised to enclose all of reality inside a single finished structure of thought. And both, in their different voices, forced philosophy back from the airy generality of the system to the single living individual, the one person who must actually exist, suffer, choose, and die. That is what Jaspers took from them, and he never pretended the debt was small. Consider first the Dane. He lived in Copenhagen, walked its streets compulsively, broke off the engagement that might have made him ordinary, and poured a strange torrent of books into a city that mostly laughed at him. His quarrel was with a grand philosophy that claimed history itself was reason working its way toward completion, a system so total that the thinker could survey all of being from above, as if from the standpoint of the finished whole. Against that serene confidence he set a single stubborn fact. No living person stands at the end of history. Each of us stands inside our own unfinished life, having to decide, having to act, with the outcome unknown and the responsibility unshared. Truth, he argued, is not merely a result you prove on paper and then file away. The truth that matters is something a single person must take up, live, and stake an existence on, in fear and in the dark, with no guarantee that the staking will be rewarded. He was a believer, intensely and painfully so, and his model was the solitary man of faith who risks everything on what cannot be demonstrated. You cannot, he kept saying, get the decisive thing second-hand. You cannot inherit it as a conclusion. You have to become it. Now the German, and the difference could hardly be sharper in mood, while the structure of the challenge stays the same. Nietzsche was no believer. He announced, in a phrase that has echoed ever since, that the old God was dead, that the inherited certainties of religion and morality had quietly lost their hold even among those who still went through the motions. He did not say this with triumph. He said it as a man reporting an avalanche he could see coming and that no one else seemed to hear. If the old foundations were gone, then humanity faced a task without precedent. We would have to live and judge and create values without the inherited supports that had carried earlier ages. That is a terrifying freedom, and Nietzsche refused to soften it. He tore into the comfortable assumptions of his century, its faith in progress, its respectable morality, its quiet conviction that the universe was arranged for human benefit. Where the Dane had recalled philosophy to the inwardness of the believer, the German recalled it to the exposed condition of the human being, left to stand on nothing but his own honesty. Different as they were, Jaspers heard them as a pair, and he heard in both the same liberating blow. Each had broken the spell of the closed system. Each had shown that the deepest questions cannot be settled by building ever larger structures of abstract thought, because the thinker is not a spectator outside reality, but a particular person caught inside it, with one life to spend. After Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, Jaspers believed you could no longer do philosophy as if the philosopher were a disembodied I surveying everything from nowhere. The exception, the outsider, the man writing in pain and against his age, had become the truest witness to what thinking is for. This is the soil from which his own work grew, and he was honest enough to say that without these two, it could not have grown at all. He returned to Nietzsche at length in a book that appeared in 1936, and the way he read him tells us almost everything about Jaspers as an interpreter. He refused to treat Nietzsche as the bearer of a doctrine. There was, he insisted, no tidy system to extract, no list of teachings you could write down and defend. What Nietzsche offered instead was a way of questioning, restless and experimental, forever testing a thought and then turning to test its opposite. Jaspers noticed what lazy readers ignored, that Nietzsche contradicts himself constantly, praising on one page what he condemns on another. The temptation is to pick the half you like and call that the real Nietzsche. Jaspers did the opposite. He argued that you must read Nietzsche against himself, holding the contradictions open rather than resolving them, because the contradictions are the thinking. The movement between opposed positions, the willingness to wound his own convictions, was the living philosophy, and to freeze it into a creed was to kill exactly what made it alive. You honour such a thinker not by obeying him, but by continuing to question with him. The timing of that book gives it a weight Jaspers could not have arranged and would not have wished. At the very moment he was patiently reclaiming the real Nietzsche, the free and self-wounding questioner who could be pinned to no single thesis, the regime that had taken power around him was busy canonizing a crude and falsified Nietzsche, a cartoon strongman pressed into the service of a cause he would have despised. Two readings of one dead man stood opposed in the same years, in the same country. One reduced him to a slogan and a weapon. The other restored him to his difficulty, his irony, his refusal to be owned. There is a quiet courage in scholarship of that kind, in spending years insisting that a thinker is more complicated than the propagandists need him to be, at a time when complication itself had become suspect. So the lineage Jaspers claimed was not a comfortable one. He did not descend from the great builders of systems, the philosophers who left behind cathedrals of argument you could walk through and admire. He descended from two solitary men who attacked such cathedrals, who wrote against their century from its margins, and who handed philosophy back to the single person who has to live it. From the Dane he took the conviction that truth must be inwardly lived and risked, not merely proved. From the German he took the courage to face existence after the old certainties had fallen. Out of that double inheritance, and against the systems both of them had shaken, he would build something stranger and more careful than either, a philosophy that tries to keep the question permanently open. But the awakening came first, and it came from the two dead men he never stopped reading. In 1932, Karl Jaspers published a work in 3 volumes and gave it the plainest title a philosopher has ever dared to use. He called it simply Philosophy. There is a quiet audacity in that bare word. A man might title his life's work with a grand and ringing phrase, a promise of some new system, some final account of being. Jaspers refused all of that. He set down the oldest and broadest name the discipline owns, and he let it stand alone, undecorated, as if to say that he was not adding one more doctrine to the shelf, but trying to do the thing itself. The plainness is not modesty. It is a claim about what the word ought to mean. He made that claim as an outsider, and he knew it. He had come to philosophy by an unusual road, through law abandoned, through medicine, through years of patient work in psychiatry, and the established philosophers of the German universities did not forget where he had started. To them, he was the former psychiatrist, the doctor who had wandered into their field and presumed to take a chair that should have gone to one of their own. They scorned him for it. He had not served the long apprenticeship in the history of the discipline that they counted as the price of entry. And yet that very distance was part of what he brought. He had spent years bent over the inner lives of suffering people, and he had learned there how little any finished theory ever captures of a single human being. He carried that lesson into philosophy and made it the spine of the whole work. For the deepest conviction behind the 3 volumes is this: philosophy is not a body of results. It is not a stock of conclusions that one generation proves and the next inherits and stores away, like the findings of chemistry or astronomy. It is an activity, something a living person does, a perpetual movement of thought that never comes to rest in any fixed position, but pushes past each one as soon as it is reached. The sciences accumulate. They build, brick on brick, a structure that stands when its builders are gone. Philosophy does not accumulate in that way. What one chemist establishes the next need not establish again, but what a philosopher understands each person must understand for himself or not at all. Each thinker must perform it again, from the beginning, in the one life given to him, and the moment it hardens into a settled doctrine that can simply be handed down and memorized, it has stopped being philosophy and become a corpse of it, a set of dead propositions about which the living question no longer stirs. So the great work was built, deliberately and with enormous care, to resist becoming a finished thing. This is the strange achievement of it. Most large philosophical works are machines for producing certainty. They erect a system, close its doors, and invite you to live inside. Jaspers built something that holds its doors open on purpose, a structure designed to keep the listener in motion rather than to house him. Every time the thought nears a place where it might settle and call itself the truth, it turns and moves past that place toward what no formula can hold. The aim is not to leave you with a possession you can carry away and repeat. The aim is to set a movement going in you that you must continue yourself, because no one can do it on your behalf. That refusal of system is not vagueness, and it is not a license to drift. The work has a clear architecture, 3 great movements, and it is worth naming them plainly even while leaving their full weight for the slow unfolding to come. The first movement Jaspers called world orientation. The second he called the illumination of selfhood. The third he called metaphysics. They are not 3 compartments of a doctrine, but 3 phases of a single act of thinking, and he meant the reader to travel all of them. The architecture is itself a map of an activity rather than a diagram of a finished doctrine. It does not lay out a territory already conquered and surveyed. It marks 3 directions in which the restless movement of thought travels, 3 ways the mind goes out past the settled and the known. This is why the bare title is exactly right, and why nothing grander would have served. To call the work philosophy and nothing more is to say that what matters is not the particular conclusions a reader might extract, but the act the reader is drawn into, the same act that every genuine thinker has performed since the beginning, asked again now under the conditions of a century that had lost its old certainties. Jaspers was not handing down answers to be filed away. He was trying to keep one question permanently alive, to build a book that could not be closed because the questioning inside it could not be finished. A philosophy that stays open is harder to use than a philosophy that settles everything. You cannot simply look up what it concludes, and you cannot master it once and be done. but it asks to be lived rather than learned, and that for him was the whole difference between thought that is alive and thought that has died into a result. A doorway leads somewhere, and the question of this chapter is where. The whole of that long, patient architecture, the opening built rather than the house, was meant to lead a person to one thing, and that thing was a self. Not a self in general, a particular self, the one doing the reading, the one drifting now towards sleep. Everything Jaspers wrote about the illumination of selfhood begins from a distinction so simple that we tend to walk straight past it, and so consequential that once we see it, we cannot quite walk back. There are two senses of the word self, and they do not name the same thing. The first is the self that can be studied. Call it the empirical self, the self of fact. It is the creature biology examines and psychology measures and society describes, the self with a date of birth and a blood type, a temperament, a set of habits, a history of illnesses, a place in a family and a class, and a nation. This self is real. It can be weighed and charted and explained by its causes, and a great deal of what we are belongs to it. When a doctor takes a pulse, when a census taker writes down an occupation, when a friend says that we have always been stubborn or always been kind, it is this self they are speaking of, the self that is a thing among things in the world, available to be known from outside. And then there is the other self, the one Jaspers cared about most, and the difficulty is that it cannot be found in the same way because it is not a fact at all. It is not a trait you could discover by looking long enough. It is the self a person can become. It has no fixed location and no finished shape because it is never a completed object but always a possibility, something brought into being only through decision, through commitment, through the act of choosing. You will not stumble upon it by inspecting yourself the way you might inspect a stranger. It is not lying somewhere inside, waiting to be uncovered like a buried coin. It comes to exist only in the doing. This is the hard hinge of the whole idea, so let us hold it still for a moment. The deeper self cannot be known the way a thing is known. It cannot be pointed at. The instant you try to grasp it as an object, to fix it, to say there it is, that is what I am, it has already slipped, because the very saying is one more act that either confirms the self or betrays it. Jaspers writes that this self can only be appealed to, never demonstrated. You cannot prove it to anyone, least of all yourself. You can only call to it and answer the call. It is lit from within rather than grasped from without, a light that the one living the life must kindle, not a surface that an observer could illuminate and then describe. How then does such a self come to itself, if not by being studied? It comes to itself above all in the limit situations. Those are the walls against which a life finally presses, named already and not to be reopened here, the places where the ordinary machinery of coping runs out and a person stands exposed to what cannot be managed or explained away. The empirical self meets those walls and reaches for its usual defences, its routines, its distractions, its reassurances. But there is a different possibility in the same moment. A person can stop defending and instead step forward, and in that step become someone. The self that can be is born precisely where the self that merely is has nothing left to say. And it is born through freedom, though not freedom as we usually picture it, the idle freedom of choosing between this coat and that one. Jaspers means something far heavier. He means the freedom of an act in which a person stakes himself, puts his whole being on the line of a decision, so that afterward he is not the same. There is a kind of choosing in which you do not merely select an option, but commit yourself, wager who you are upon what you do, and discover that the choosing has made you. In that wager the self is not expressed, as if it existed beforehand, and the act simply showed it. In that wager, the self is constituted. You become, by deciding, the one who decided so. Now the second great feature, and it follows from the first. This self is never an abstract universal. It is never humanity in general, or the rational soul as such, or the dignified figure that fits every case equally. It is always this person, here, now, in this time and no other, inside this irreplaceable knot of circumstances that has never occurred before and will never occur again. The empirical self can be compared with 1,000 others, sorted, ranked, generalized. The self one can become cannot, because it is bound to a single concrete life, rooted in one place on the earth and one stretch of years, owning these parents, these losses, this particular love, this exact and unrepeatable situation. There is no spare copy of it anywhere. This is why, for Jaspers, no general rule can ever hand the deeper self to anyone ready-made. Rules are universal by their nature. They speak to everyone and therefore to no one in particular, and the self that matters is always in particular. A maxim can tell you what any person ought to do in a situation of a certain type, but your situation is not of a type. It is yours. The moment of genuine decision is the moment when the rule has said all it can say and falls silent, and you are left standing in a place no rule foresaw, having to answer for a life that only you are living. The answer cannot be looked up. It can only be enacted by you, as the very act of becoming yourself. So we arrive at a portrait nearly the reverse of the one we expected. We tend to imagine the true self as something deep within, private, hidden, most itself when most alone, a kernel we would find if only we could dig past everything the world has piled on top. Jaspers turns that picture inside out. The self that can be is not a possession lying in reserve. It is an achievement, perpetually unfinished, kindled only in the act, only at the limits, only in the freedom where a person stakes himself, and only ever in one concrete and irreplaceable life. It is never a thing you have. It is always a thing you are doing or failing to do. There is one more turn, and it is the one this chapter only points toward without taking. For Jaspers, the self does not come to itself in isolation either. It comes to be only with another. The self that can be is awakened not in the sealed room of private thought, but in the open space between persons, and what passes there is the proper subject of what comes next. For now it is enough to have seen the shape of the thing. The deeper self is no fact to be found, but a possibility to be lived, lit from inside, staked in freedom, rooted in this single life, and reaching already towards someone else. There is a picture of the philosopher that we inherit almost without noticing, and it is the picture of a solitary genius. A single mind in a single room, working through the night, reasoning his way down to the bedrock of things by the sheer force of private thought. Jaspers spent his life arguing against that picture. His claim was simple to state and difficult to absorb. The deepest truth, the truth that has to do with who a person actually is not something anyone reaches alone. It is something that can only happen between two people. It is not found and then reported. It comes into being in the space between them, or it does not come into being at all. This follows from everything we have already said about the self one can become, that self is never an object, never finished, never a thing that can be inspected from the outside. And precisely because of this, it cannot complete itself in solitude. A self locked in its own company has nothing to test it, nothing to call it out of its evasions, no second presence to confirm that it is real. I can think alone, certainly. I can solve problems alone, prove theorems, arrange arguments in order. But I cannot become myself alone, because becoming a self means being seen, being addressed and answering. Jaspers gives this a name. He calls it communication, and he means by it something far stronger than the ordinary exchange of information. The heart of it he describes as a loving struggle. Hold both words at once because each corrects the other. It is a struggle, a genuine contest, two people contending in full earnest over what is true and what is real, neither smoothing things over, neither sparing the other the hard question. And it is loving, which means the contest is fought without weapons and without the wish to win. These are two people who want truth more than they want to be right, and who want each other's real selfhood as much as their own. Picture what that asks. Each person lays himself open. Each agrees in advance to be questioned all the way to the bottom, to have his comfortable self-image taken apart, to expose the places he would rather keep hidden even from himself. Nothing is held in reserve, no private corner kept safe, no argument deployed merely to gain the upper hand. The two press on each other precisely because they refuse to let each other settle for anything false. And here is the strange shape of it. In an ordinary argument, you win by defeating the other, by leaving him without an answer. In the loving struggle, winning would be a kind of failure. If I overpower you, if I corner you, if I walk away the victor with you reduced to silence, then the whole thing has collapsed, because the aim was never my victory. The aim was a truth the two of us could hold in common, a truth that belongs to neither of us alone and could not have come to either of us alone. To beat you is to lose the only thing worth having. This is why Jaspers is so severe with the figure of the lonely thinker, the one who supposes that behind a closed door, by reasoning alone, he can arrive at the final truths about existence and the self. About the structure of the physical world, such a thinker may learn a great deal in solitude. But about who he is, about what it means to be a self-facing death and guilt and chance, the closed door guarantees only that he will deceive himself in comfort with no one present to notice. Solitude has its own vanity. It mistakes the absence of contradiction for the presence of truth. The thinker alone is never refuted, and so he never grows. He polishes his certainties undisturbed and calls the silence agreement. There is a tenderness in all this that is unusual in philosophy, and it did not come from nowhere. Jaspers thought as he did about communication because he had lived it. His whole sense that a self comes into being only with another self was rooted in his own life, and above all in his marriage to Gertrude, in a daily companionship of complete honesty that became for him the very model of what truth between persons could be. He was not theorizing about an ideal he had read about. He was describing, in careful and general terms, something he knew from the inside, every day, across a lifetime. That is part of why the idea carries the weight it does. A man can write coldly about love. Jaspers wrote about it as someone reporting from within it. So we are left with a demand that is both severe and warm. Severe because it forbids the quiet self-satisfaction of the mind that answers only to itself, and asks instead that we make ourselves vulnerable, that we let another person reach all the way in. Warm because what it offers in return is the one thing solitude can never give. Not victory, not the security of being unchallenged, but the slow emergence of a real self in the presence of another real self, each helping the other to become what neither could become alone. Truth at this level is not a possession. It is a shared event, lived out between two people who have agreed to hold nothing back and who have understood that the point was never to win. Consider what happens in the simplest act of knowing. You look at a single thing, a lamp on a table, a word on a page, a fact about the world, and to see it at all, you must mark it off from everything it is not. Knowing is a kind of cutting. To grasp anything as an object, you draw a line around it and let the rest fall away into background. And here Jaspers noticed something that would organize the whole of his later thought. the thing you have grasped is always a fragment. It has been lifted out of a hole that does not end where your attention ends, a hole that goes on past every edge you can find. This is the idea he called the encompassing. The name is plain once you hear what it points to. Being is always more than anything we can seize and hold before the mind. Whenever we know something particular, and that particular thing stands out against a wider field that we do not know in the same way, that we cannot turn into an object without leaving a still wider field behind it. The whole contains every horizon and is never itself contained. It encompasses us rather than standing out in front of us to be examined. The image of the horizon is the one Jaspers trusted most, and it carries the argument almost by itself. Stand anywhere and look out, and the world closes in a ring at the limit of sight. That ring is your horizon, the boundary of what you can take in from where you happen to stand. Now walk toward it. The ring does not stay put. It withdraws as you advance, and a new band of country opens beyond the old line, and that new country has its own far edge, which will withdraw again the moment you reach for it. You never arrive at the horizon. You cannot, because it is not a place in the landscape, but the form of your standing in the landscape at all. So it is, he argued, with everything we understand. Every boundary of our knowledge, once we reach it, turns out to be the threshold of something further. Each science maps its own territory and draws the frame that makes its work possible, and the frame that lets one inquiry begin is exactly what shuts another inquiry out. There is no final horizon that gathers all the others inside it and closes the picture for good. The encompassing is precisely that which can never be brought within a horizon, because it is the ground out of which every horizon is cut and into which every horizon dissolves. He worked this out in the middle of the 1930s, and he gave it the dry form of a logic, a careful inventory of the ways being shows itself to a mind that knows it can never get behind being as a whole. The inventory has a shape worth holding on to, because the encompassing is not a single fog. It shows itself in distinct modes, and the first division runs between the encompassing that we ourselves are and the encompassing that being itself is. Begin with what we are, since that is nearest. We are first living bodily existence, creatures who breathe and hunger and stand in a particular place in the world, bound to a body that was born and will die. This is the most immediate whole each of us is, and even here we exceed our own grasp, for no account of the body ever quite reaches the life that is living it. We are, second, the shared consciousness through which any world appears at all. Whatever is for a mind, given in the forms that let a thing show up as a thing, and this consciousness is not yours alone, but a structure we hold in common, the reason your world and mine can be the same world. And we are, third, spirit, the movement that is never content with fragments and reaches for wholeness, that wants the parts to cohere, that drives toward a totality of meaning it can approach but never finish. These are not three substances stacked inside a person. They are three ways the whole of what we are overflows whatever picture we form of ourselves. You can study the body and miss the life. You can describe consciousness and stand outside the meaning it carries. At each level, the same lesson returns. What we are is more than what we can make into an object and set before us, even when the object we are reaching for is ourselves. Then there is the encompassing that being itself is, being not as it appears to us, but as it stands on its own. Jaspers approached it from two sides. On one side lies the world, the whole of all that is there to be encountered and investigated, which no science will ever exhaust because every science works inside a frame, and the world is not a frame. On the other side lies transcendence, the encompassing that being itself most deeply is, the ground that no knowing reaches. He gives it that name here and carries it no further. What transcendence is, and how a mind without dogma might so much as gesture toward it, belongs to the next turn of the argument. For now the name marks a direction, the far side of being, the limit past which thought can point but cannot walk. There is one more mode he set apart, and it is the hinge between the others. Reason is the bond that holds across all of these regions, the openness that refuses to let any one of them seal itself off and pass for the whole. It is the binding power in the structure, and it has its own full treatment further on. Here it is enough to name it as the link, the wakefulness that keeps the modes of the encompassing from hardening into separate dogmas. Now stand back and ask what all of this is for, because Jaspers was not building a map of being for its own sake. The deep use of the encompassing is that it stands guard. It is a permanent defense against every closed system and every claim to total knowledge, against the recurring temptation to believe that some single framework, some science or doctrine or worldview has at last gathered reality whole into its grip. The moment a system declares itself complete, it has mistaken one horizon for the end of all horizons. It has taken the fragment it can hold for the being that holds it, and the encompassing is the standing reminder that this can never be so, that behind the horizon you have reached there is always another, and behind that one another still. This is not a counsel of despair, and it is not a confession that knowledge fails. We do know, and we know more each year, and the fragments we cut out of the whole are real and hard won. The point is only that knowing is approach and never capture. Reality is not the kind of thing that gets finished. It is approached, circled, drawn nearer, and it recedes as we advance exactly as the horizon recedes from the walker. Not because our eyes are weak, but because that is what a horizon is. To live in the truth of the encompassing is to keep knowing without ever pretending to have closed the account, to hold the open hole open, and to feel, at the edge of every certainty, the wider dark in which that certainty floats. And it is at that edge that the next question waits. For if behind every horizon there lies another, the mind is pressed at last toward the far side of all of them, toward the ground that grounds the rest and shows up in no horizon at all. There is a ground beneath all things that can never be known. Jaspers gives it a name without claiming to know it. He calls it transcendence, the ultimate source from which everything that exists takes its being, the same reality that religion has always called God. And the paradox sits right at the center of his thought. This ground can never be seen, never grasped, never set before the mind as an object the way a stone or a number or a star can be set there. It leaves only signs. So the world itself becomes a kind of script, a writing we are forever reading and never finish translating, a language whose words point past themselves toward a meaning we cannot hold in our hands. Begin with what transcendence is not. It is not a thing in the world. You will not find it among the objects that science counts and measures, not because science has not looked hard enough, but because it belongs to a different order entirely. Everything we can know, we know as an object standing over against us, as something we point at and define. Transcendence is never such a something. The moment we turn it into one, the moment we say it is this and not that, located here, shaped so, doing these particular deeds, we have already lost it. We have pulled the infinite ground down into the finite world and made it one more item on the inventory. Jaspers is unbending on this point. Transcendence is approached by thought, but it is never captured by thought. It is real, more real than anything, yet it is never a fact. We reach toward it precisely at the edge where our knowing gives out. How then does it reach us at all? If it is never an object, never a fact, never a thing we can point to, how does it speak? Here Jaspers offers his most beautiful idea. Transcendence speaks to us in ciphers. A cipher is a sign that points beyond itself, a hint, a trace, a coded letter from a source we cannot see. The whole of the visible world can be read this way. Nature is a cipher. The night sky, the sea, the slow turning of the seasons, all of it can become transparent, can begin to shine with a meaning that is not its own, a meaning that comes from beyond it and passes through it the way light passes through coloured glass. History is a cipher. The rise and ruin of peoples, the long human struggle, can be read as a script in which something deeper is being said. Art is a cipher, perhaps the clearest of all, for the work of a great painter or composer carries a presence that no inventory of its physical parts can explain. And human existence itself, our freedom, our love, our reaching, is a cipher, a sign that we are more than the matter we are made of. Notice carefully what a cipher does and what it does not do. It points. It does not deliver. It opens a direction without arriving at a destination. The world read as cipher does not hand us a doctrine. It does not yield a list of truths about transcendence that we could write down, agree upon, and defend. A cipher is not a code in the ordinary sense, the kind you decode once and for all into a plain message you can then file away and forget the code. The cipher remains a cipher. It keeps its depth. It goes on speaking, and what it says can never be exhausted, never be settled, never be reduced to a fixed translation that closes the matter. We read, and the reading never ends because the thing being said exceeds every word we find for it. This is why Jaspers issues a warning so central that the whole idea stands or falls with it. The cipher must be kept as a cipher. To harden it into a settled creed, to take the sign and mistake it for the thing it signifies, to say that the coded letter is itself the source, is to destroy the cipher altogether. Imagine a sign on a road that points toward a distant city. The traveller who stops at the sign, who sets up house beside it, who worships the painted arrow and never walks the road, has misunderstood everything the sign was for. So it is when we take a cipher of transcendence and freeze it into literal fact or rigid dogma. We turn a living indication into a dead object. We make the infinite into one more finite possession, a thing to be owned and defended and used against other people who own a different one. The cipher was a window opening on what cannot be possessed. Harden it, and the glass goes opaque. The light stops coming through. What was a path toward the ground becomes a wall in front of it. The sin against transcendence, if we may speak that way, is not doubt. It is the false certainty that closes the sign and calls the matter finished. So the ciphers stay open, plural, ambiguous, never resolving into a single creed. And among them there is one that Jaspers raises above the rest, the supreme cipher, the deepest writing of all. He calls it foundering, and the older image is shipwreck. It means simply this: every human project finally breaks. Every system of thought, however grand, runs at last into its own limit and cannot pass beyond it. Every life, no matter how full or wise or strong, comes apart against the conditions it cannot master and ends in failure. The body fails. The plan fails. The understanding, pressed far enough, fails. We build, and what we build founders, the way a ship that has crossed great distances goes down at last upon the rocks. This is not one misfortune among others. It is the shape of the human condition seen whole. We are the beings whose every undertaking carries its own breaking inside it from the start. Now the ordinary response to this is despair, and Jaspers does not pretend the despair is unreal, but he sees something inside the breaking that despair cannot see. Foundering, he says, is the supreme cipher, the place where transcendence becomes most legible. Precisely where our power ends, precisely where the project we trusted comes to nothing, something else can become visible that was hidden as long as we were succeeding. While we are building and winning and mastering, the world stays opaque, a field of objects we manipulate, and we imagine ourselves the authors of our being. It is when the building fails that the ground beneath the building can show itself. The wreck is where the sea becomes visible. To founder honestly, with open eyes, neither denying the failure nor drowning in it, is to read the last and clearest line of the script. The limit that defeats us is also the edge along which the infinite touches the finite. We meet transcendence not at the summit of our powers, but at the point where our powers give out, and we are still, somehow, ourselves. This is the dignity hidden inside failure, and it is a strange and quiet dignity, easy to miss. It does not rescue us. Foundering offers no consolation of the cheap kind, no promise that the loss will be repaid, no assurance that the wreck was secretly a victory. The failure stays a failure. The ship goes down. And yet the human being who faces that going down without flinching, who does not lie about it and does not collapse before it, stands in a relation to the ground of all being that no triumph could have given. There is a way of breaking that affirms. There is a foundering that, in the very act of failing, says yes to the source from which we came and to which we return. The meaning does not lie around the failure, softening it. The meaning lies inside the failure, legible only there. Hold the distinction clearly, because it is easy to blur. The hard edges of existence that Jaspers had already named, death and suffering and struggle and guilt and chance, those situations we cannot get behind or around, belong to an earlier part of his thought and have their own name. Foundering is not simply another word for them. It is the cipher they become when they are read at the level of transcendence, the metaphysical meaning of the limit rather than the limit itself. The boundary is the wall. Foundering is what the wall says when we finally listen to it, and what it says cannot be carried away as a teaching. It can only be heard once in the breaking by the one who is breaking, and even then it points beyond itself and is gone. So we are left where the chapter began, reading a script we will never finish. Transcendence withholds itself and signs to us through everything that is. The world, nature, history, art, our own existence, all of it shines and points and refuses to be pinned down. We are forbidden the comfort of the final translation, the doctrine that would let us stop reading. And the clearest word in the whole script is the word our own failure speaks. This is a philosophy with no triumphant ending, no system completed, no certainty seized and held. It asks us to read the signs without closing them, to face the shipwreck without denying it, and to find, in that double honesty, the only nearness to the ground of all things that finite beings are given. The reading goes on. It was never meant to end. The gravest danger to a human mind is not doubt. It is certainty. We are taught to fear confusion, to dread the open question that has no settled answer, and we imagine that the worst fate of a thinking person is to be lost. Jaspers reversed this. The mind in real danger, he believed, is the mind that has stopped moving, the one that has seized a single truth and shut itself around it like a fist. And against that closing, he set a word that most of us have learned to use coldly: reason. Not the narrow faculty of calculation, not the adding up of facts, but the power that keeps a self open, communicating, and honest. Reason, for Jaspers, was the opposite of the cold thing the word usually names. It was boundless openness. He gave this its fullest form in his lectures on reason and existence, delivered in 1935, in a Germany already feverish with men who were certain of everything. There he set two words side by side and refused to let either swallow the other. On one side stood the self that each of us is, the singular existence rooted in one concrete life, the part of us that decides and suffers and cannot be replaced. On the other stood reason, which is not a self at all but a movement, a reaching, a bond. The self without reason hardens into mere willfulness, a private fortress that calls its own preferences truth. Reason without the self thins into empty generality, clever and bloodless, true about everything and committed to nothing. The two need each other. Reason gives the self its openness. The self gives reason something real to be open from. What does reason do then in this larger sense? It holds the modes of being together. It is the bond that keeps every region of truth in conversation with every other and refuses to let any one of them announce that it is the whole. There is the truth of the senses, the truth of the living body, the truth of the mind that thinks, the truth of the self that exists. Each is real. Each tells us something, and the temptation always is to take one of them, the one we happen to love or fear, and crown it as the single key to everything. Reason is the standing refusal of that coronation. It is the willingness to keep listening when a part of the truth begins to claim it is all the truth. In this Jaspers was the heir of Kant, and he said so plainly. From Kant he took the great lesson that the human mind does not stand over reality like a god, surveying the whole, but moves inside limits it can never quite step beyond. Our grasp is always a grasp of something, framed by the one who grasps, and the being that we reach toward, what he called the encompassing, always exceeds the frame. Kant had drawn the boundary of knowledge not to humiliate the mind, but to keep it honest, to stop it from mistaking its own structures for the architecture of all that is. Jaspers carried that honesty forward into a darker century. Where Kant feared the dogmatism of the lecture hall, Jaspers faced the dogmatism of the street, the rising hunger for an answer so total and so loud that no further question could survive it. For that is the deadliest temptation of the mind, and naming it is this chapter's whole burden. It is to seize one truth and close around it, to take apart and call it the whole, to feel the relief of certainty and mistake, that relief for knowledge. The closed mind does not experience itself as closed. It experiences itself as finally clear, finally strong, finally done with the exhausting business of weighing and listening. It calls its closing conviction. It calls its deafness loyalty. And it is precisely here, Jaspers saw, that reason and unreason part ways, not over how much a person knows, but over whether the person remains able to be addressed, to be questioned, to be surprised by what another sees. The fanatic may be brilliant. He may have read everything. What he has lost is not intelligence, but the openness that lets intelligence stay honest. So reason, set against this fever, is not a body of conclusions. It is an endless willingness. The willingness to stay in question rather than flee into a final answer. The willingness to meet the other person, not as an obstacle to be overcome, but as someone who might be carrying a piece of the truth you do not hold, which is why reason and that loving struggle between persons are finally the same disposition seen from two sides. The willingness, hardest of all, to remain open to what exceeds you entirely, to refuse the comfort of a closed system even when the closing would feel like peace. Reason keeps the wound of the open question from healing over too soon, because a question healed too soon is a thought that has died. There is something almost austere in this, and something quietly heroic. To live by reason in Jaspers' sense is to give up the deepest consolation the mind can offer itself, the consolation of being finished. It is to accept that the work of understanding has no last day. The reasonable person is not the one with the most settled views. It is the one who, holding a truth with real conviction, can still turn toward another human being and genuinely ask, "And what do you see?" That turning, repeated through a whole life, is what Jaspers meant by reason. Not the cold thing, the open thing, the bond that refuses the fever and keeps the mind alive. Every account of reason is tested somewhere by a particular face. For Jaspers, the test had a name, and the name was Martin Heidegger. They met when both were young and unknown, two men who felt the academic philosophy of their day as something stale, a machinery of footnotes and schools that had lost contact with the one question worth asking, the question of what it is to exist. Around 1920, they began the friendship that would mark them both. Heidegger was the more dazzling, a man who could make an ancient Greek sentence tremble as if it had been written that morning. Jaspers was the more settled, already a presence, a doctor-turned-philosopher with a household and a reputation. What drew them was a shared sense of mission. They believed, with the certainty of the young, that the two of them together would overturn the lifeless thing the universities called philosophy and put something living in its place. The letters from those years are ardent, almost military in their warmth. They spoke of themselves as a fighting community of two, a small band set against a large and complacent world. Heidegger came to stay in the house at Heidelberg, and the two would talk deep into the night, then walk, then talk again, and Jaspers later remembered those visits as among the happiest intellectual hours of his life. Here was the loving struggle made flesh, two minds pressing on each other without flattery, each sharpening the other, each trusting that the friction was a form of love. They did not always agree. Heidegger thought Jaspers too cautious, too tied to science and to the cool inheritance of Kant. Jaspers sensed in Heidegger something willful, a thinker who could be brilliant and yet strangely deaf, who lectured even in conversation. But these were the ordinary frictions of a real bond, and for more than a decade the bond held. Then came 1933, and the bond did not so much break as reveal what it had been resting on. Heidegger joined the Nazi Party. He became the head of his university, and in that office he gave a notorious address that yoked the university itself, its teaching and its students, to the new regime, dressing surrender in the language of destiny and awakening. For Jaspers, this was at once a philosophical catastrophe and an intimate wound, for Gertrude, his wife of more than 20 years, came from a Jewish family, and the regime Heidegger had just embraced had marked such families for ruin. The friend who had sat at their table, who had been welcomed as one of the household, had crossed over to the side of those who threatened it. The betrayal was double. It struck at everything Jaspers believed about thinking, and it struck at his own home. There was a visit that fixed the rupture in memory. Heidegger came once more to the house, and Jaspers found him changed, full of an enthusiasm he could not share and could barely follow. Heidegger spoke of the new movement with the eagerness of a convert, and when Jaspers objected, when he asked how a man of such cultivation could lend himself to people so crude, Heidegger answered with a remark about the need to be educated by the movement, as if barbarism were a school. What chilled Jaspers most was not the politics alone, it was the blindness. Heidegger seemed genuinely unable to see what the new order meant for this particular house, for this particular woman who had poured his coffee and listened to his arguments. He sat in a home he was helping to endanger and felt nothing of the danger. After that, continuation was impossible. The letters thinned, then stopped. The fighting community of two was over, not in a quarrel, but in a silence, and the silence lasted through all the years that followed, years in which Jaspers and Gertrude lived under a deepening shadow. The friendship had one more chapter, and it was the hardest. When the war was over and the country lay in ruins, committees were formed to decide which professors might be allowed to teach again, and Heidegger's case came before one of them. Jaspers, known to have been a victim of the regime and known to have been Heidegger's friend, was asked to write an assessment. He could have refused. He could have taken revenge or extended a quiet mercy. He did neither. He wrote a judgment that was measured in its tone and devastating in its substance. He acknowledged Heidegger's philosophical gifts without reservation, called him one of the few genuinely speculative minds of the age, and then he described that mind as it had come to seem to him, unfree, dictatorial, a manner of thinking that did not open toward another person, but closed against him, shut off from the very communication that Jaspers held to be the test of all real thought. Such a teacher, he wrote, should be kept from the lecture hall for some years until it could be seen whether he had changed. It was the verdict of a man applying his own deepest principle, reason as the bond that refuses fanaticism, to the friend who had broken it. The recommendation cost him. He knew it would be read as the act of an enemy, and he knew it was not. It was the act of someone who had loved this man and could not pretend for the sake of that love that the thinking and the conduct could be separated, that a philosophy of authentic existence could shrug off the existence of its philosopher. The two never truly reconciled. There were a few cool letters in later years, a few attempts that failed to catch, but the warmth never returned. What remained was something stranger and sadder than enmity. Each went on regarding the other as the one contemporary who had genuinely understood him, the one worth arguing with, and each knew the argument could no longer be had. It is the loneliest thing in Jasper's life, this severed friendship, and it is also the clearest proof of what he meant by his philosophy. He had said that truth at the highest level lives only between persons. With Heidegger, he had tasted that, and then watched it fail, and he never stopped grieving the failure, because he never stopped believing in what had been lost. There is a small apartment in Heidelberg in the last winter of the war, where two people have lived for years inside a closing circle. The curtains are drawn early. The telephone, when it rings, frightens them. Visitors have grown rare because to be seen with them is dangerous, and the few who still come do so quietly and do not stay long. Karl Jaspers and his wife Gertrude have learned the shape of this silence the way a sick man learns the shape of a long illness, and Jaspers, who had known illness intimately since his youth, recognized it. The danger was not abstract. It had a name and an address and a calendar. Gertrude was Jewish, and that single fact in the Germany of those years had begun slowly and methodically to close around them both. It had not happened all at once. It almost never does. The regime that came to power early in the 1930s did not destroy the couple with a single blow. It tightened around them by degrees, year after year, each turn of the screw small enough that one could imagine, for a while, that it might be the last. First came the narrowing of his public life. In 1937, Jaspers was forced out of his professorship, stripped of the chair he had held in Heidelberg, removed from the lecture hall and from the students who were the daily proof that thinking still mattered to someone other than himself. A teacher who cannot teach is asked to become a different kind of man. He was nearly that, but not quite, because the writing remained. Then in 1938, even that public door was shut. He was forbidden to publish. The sentences he wrote could no longer reach a reader. For a philosopher, this is a peculiar kind of burial, to go on producing pages that, by law, no one is permitted to see. And yet here the story bends in a direction that is hard to explain and harder to forget, because the silenced years were not empty years. They were, in a strange and stubborn way, among the most productive of his life. He kept writing. He wrote privately, for a drawer, for no audience, for a future that he had no firm reason to believe he would live to see. The great books he would publish after the war, the works on faith without dogma and on the long-shared conversation of humanity, were taking shape in those locked rooms, in the dark, addressed to nobody. A man who writes for a drawer in a country that has forbidden his voice is making a wager that the world will outlast its present masters, and that the wager mattered more than its odds. We should be careful not to make this sound braver or calmer than it was. The isolation was real, and it was corrosive. Their circle thinned. Friends emigrated, or fell silent, or simply stopped coming. Some were taken. The old alliance with Heidegger had already broken, and that wound, narrated elsewhere, was part of the larger desolation of those years, the sense of a world of friends and colleagues that had emptied out around them. They were watched. They knew they were watched. Every ordinary errand, every walk to buy what little could be bought, carried the low hum of surveillance. The awareness that their continued existence in their own home was not a right, but a temporary and revocable permission. And permissions in that state were always being revised. For a long time, the couple occupied a strange and precarious category. Gertrude was married to a German who was not Jewish, and such mixed marriages had for a time offered a thin and unreliable shelter. The Jewish partners in those marriages had so far, in many cases, been spared the deportations that had already swallowed so many others. But as the war turned against Germany, as the fronts collapsed and the regime grew more desperate and more vengeful, that last thin shelter began to give way. The deportation of Jewish spouses in mixed marriages, long delayed, began to reach even those who had so far been passed over. The machinery that had spared them was being reset, and there is something especially terrible in being caught by a danger at the very moment the larger danger is collapsing, to be reached by the catastrophe just as it begins, everywhere else, to end. And so the calendar arrived. Jaspers and Gertrude learned that their own deportation had been fixed. It was set for the middle of April in 1945. They now knew, with the cold precision of a date written down somewhere in an office, roughly when the men would come for them. By then, no one in Germany could any longer pretend not to understand what deportation meant. It meant separation, almost certainly. It meant the end, almost certainly. The vague dread of years had hardened into an appointment. What they did next must be told plainly, without ornament, because to dress it up would be to betray it. They obtained poison. They acquired the means to end their own lives, and they resolved, the two of them together, that if the men came, they would die together rather than be separated and taken. This was not despair in the ordinary sense, not a collapse of the will. It was, if anything, the opposite. It was a decision, made clearly and made jointly, by two people who had spent a lifetime thinking about freedom and about the few things a human being can still choose when nearly everything has been taken away. They had been stripped of his profession, of his readers, of their friends, of their safety, of their future. What remained was the bare and final freedom to refuse the last humiliation, to refuse to be parted and marched off in different directions. They would meet the date, if it came, on their own terms and side by side. The poison was kept ready. The middle of April drew nearer. They waited. It did not come. On the 30th of March in 1945, American troops entered Heidelberg. The city was taken without the long battle that might have killed them another way, and the date on the order, the date in the middle of April, never arrived. The men with the lists did not come. The war for them was simply over, days before the thing that had been scheduled for them could happen. They had been counting toward an ending, and a different ending reached them first. They lived. It is worth holding still over how narrow that was. Not weeks, not a comfortable margin. A handful of days stood between the couple in that apartment and the appointment that had been set for their destruction. Had the front moved a little more slowly, had the city held out a little longer, had the order been written for the end of March rather than the middle of April, there would have been no later books, no post-war voice, no long second life of the work that had been waiting in the drawer. The whole of what Jaspers would become after the war, the public conscience of a ruined country, the philosopher of guilt and of faith, and of the shared human conversation, hung on those few days. He knew it. One does not forget the precise width of one's own survival. He had spent years contemplating, in the abstract, the boundary situations in which a human life is pressed against its limit, and now he and Gertrude had stood inside one of them, poison in the house, a date on the calendar, and had come out the other side alive, almost by accident, almost by grace. When the noise of liberation faded and the ordinary daylight came back into those rooms, Jaspers was a man who had been given back a future he had genuinely not expected to have. The professorship would be restored. The forbidden pages would find their readers at last. But he carried out of those years a particular knowledge that would shape everything that followed, the knowledge of what his own country had been willing to do, methodically and by appointment, to his wife and to himself, and to so many millions who had not been spared by a few days in March. He had survived the thing, and survival for a man of his temperament was not a reason to look away from it. It was an obligation to look at it harder. The question of what all of it had meant, the question of guilt, of who had done what and who had allowed it and who must now answer for it, was already forming in him before the last German soldier had laid down his arms. He had been on the inside of the catastrophe. Now he would have to find the words to speak about it from the inside to a nation that wanted more than anything not to hear them. In 1946, in a thin volume titled The Question of German Guilt, Jaspers asked his ruined country for something stranger and harder than penance. He did not ask the Germans to think less about their guilt, to set it aside, to wait for the noise of accusation to fade. He asked them to think about it more clearly. He asked them to stop using a single word, guilt, as though it named a single thing, and to sort that one heavy word into kinds. The book grew out of lectures he gave at the University of Heidelberg in the first winter after the war, when the clinic and the lecture halls had reopened, and he was permitted, after years of silence, to stand again before students and teach. Guilt was not a new subject for him. He had named it long before as one of the limit situations, one of the walls every human life runs against. Now that abstract word had put on a nation's face, and millions of those faces sat in front of him. His first move was to distinguish four kinds of guilt, and to keep them from blurring into one another, because the whole danger, he thought, lay in the blur. The first kind is criminal guilt. This is the narrowest and the clearest. A person commits definite acts that break definite laws, and those acts can be named, dated, and proved. Such guilt is established by a court. It does not rest on what a man felt or believed or belonged to, but on what he provably did, weighed against a written law. The judge is an external authority, the tribunal, applying a rule that exists before the verdict and stands apart from the one who is judged. Of the four kinds, this is the one we find easiest to recognize because we already have courts and statutes and the long machinery of the law to handle it. The second kind is political guilt. Here Jaspers reaches past the individual criminal to every citizen of the state. We live within an order that acts in our name, that signs treaties and raises armies and makes war and peace as our collective agent, and because we live by its protection and within its arrangements, we share in the consequences of what it does. This is not a guilt of the hands, but a guilt of belonging. It cannot be shrugged off by saying one held no office, cast no vote that mattered, gave no order. It cannot even be disowned by the honest claim that one did not know, for political responsibility does not turn on private knowledge. It is judged by consequences, and in the immediate aftermath, it is judged by the victors, who hold the defeated nation answerable for the deeds of the state that spoke and struck on its behalf. Every citizen bears some share of this, whether he wishes to or not. The third kind is moral guilt. Now the tribunal moves inward. For everything I myself did, and for everything I allowed, and for every moment I turned my eyes away from what was happening beside me, I am answerable, not to a court and not to the victors, but to my own conscience. Here the excuse that one merely followed orders, merely went along, merely did what everyone did, loses its force, because conscience does not accept the crowd as a defence. The judge in this case is no one outside me. It is myself, in the solitude where I cannot lie to myself for long. Two men may share exactly the same political guilt as citizens of the same state, and yet stand utterly apart in moral guilt because one resisted in small ways and suffered for it, and the other found it convenient not to see. The fourth kind is the deepest and the strangest, and Jaspers called it metaphysical guilt. It is the guilt of the survivor. He held that there is a solidarity among human beings as human beings, a bond that makes each of us co-responsible for every wrong done in our presence or with our knowledge. Where such a wrong is done, and I do not do everything I can to prevent it, and I go on living afterward, I carry a guilt that no law and no conscience in the ordinary sense can quite measure. If others were murdered and I was not, and I did not throw my own life into the scale to stop it, then the simple fact that I am still alive becomes a kind of accusation. This guilt is not answerable to any court, nor to the victors, nor finally even to my own conscience as I usually understand it. It is answerable, Jaspers said, before God alone. It is the quietest of the four and the one that never closes, the residue that remains after every verdict has been handed down and every honest reckoning with conscience has been made. Having drawn these four lines, Jaspers used them to refuse two lies at once, two consoling falsehoods that pulled at a defeated people from opposite directions. The first lie was the lie of collective innocence, the claim that ordinary Germans had known nothing, intended nothing, and therefore owed nothing. Against this he set political guilt, which binds every citizen to the state, and moral guilt, which asks each person what he personally did and allowed and looked away from. No one on these terms could step entirely clear. The second lie was the opposite one, and in its way more dangerous, the lie of collective condemnation, the idea that there was such a thing as a guilty people, a whole nation criminal in its blood, every member equally and identically stained. This Jaspers rejected with equal force. A people is not a person. A nation cannot stand in the dock, cannot examine its conscience, cannot feel remorse, for only individuals do these things. To speak of the criminal guilt of an entire people is to commit a confusion, and a cruel one, because it dissolves the real and unequal guilt of real and different persons into a fog in which the worst offender and his bravest opponent are tarred the same shade. Criminal and moral guilt belong to individuals. Only political guilt is genuinely shared by all, and even that is shared as a responsibility to be borne, not as a brand upon the soul. So the book asks of a ruined nation not less thinking but more, and finer thinking, the patient labour of holding four different weights in four different hands and refusing to pour them into one bucket. It would have been easier to say that everyone was guilty or that no one was. Jaspers thought both of those easy answers were forms of escape, ways of not facing the actual question. The harder path was to keep the distinctions clear, to let each man find his own place among the four kinds, and to understand that a nation purifies itself not by a single confession shouted in unison, but by countless persons, each alone, learning to say truthfully what he himself had done and allowed and failed to do and survived. A young woman who came to Heidelberg as his student became, across more than 4 decades and an ocean between them, one of the closest friends of his life and one of the great minds of the century. Her name was Hannah Arendt. She arrived as a student in the 1920s, restless and brilliant, already marked by a hunger for thinking that frightened more cautious teachers. She had studied first with another famous philosopher, and that early bond would later become a wound. But it was under Jaspers that she found her footing, and it was under his guidance that she wrote her doctoral dissertation, a study of the idea of love in the thought of Augustine, which she finished in 1929. She was in her early 20s. He was past 40. From that meeting of teacher and student grew one of the deep intellectual friendships of the whole century. What held them together was not agreement on every point. It was something harder and rarer, a shared trust that thinking done honestly between two people could reach a truth that neither could reach alone. This was the very thing he meant by communication, the open and unguarded encounter of oneself with another. And in her, he had found a partner equal to the demand. She argued with him. She pushed back. She brought him news of a wider and harsher world, and he listened to her as he listened to almost no one else, with a patience that never curdled into mere approval. Then the world broke in upon them. She was Jewish, and when the new regime came to power in 1933, she did not wait to see how far the darkness would spread. She fled Germany that same year, was briefly detained, made her way across Europe, and after years of statelessness and danger reached America, where she would build a second life and write the books that made her famous. For a long stretch of the war, the two of them could not so much as exchange a letter. Each had reason to fear the other was lost. But they were not lost, and when the guns fell silent, they found each other again. What followed was one of the great correspondences of modern letters, a vast exchange that ran for more than 20 years and crossed the Atlantic again and again. It is a correspondence of striking warmth and candour, full of philosophy and gossip and worry and tenderness, two people speaking with their guard entirely down. Gertrude was woven into the circle of it, addressed and loved and answered, so that the letters carry the feeling not of two correspondents, but of a small and devoted family scattered by history and refusing to be scattered in spirit. They wrote about books and about politics, about money and illness and old friends, about the deepest questions and the smallest practical ones, and through all of it ran an affection that neither the years nor the ocean could thin. Arendt revered him. She saw in Jaspers the living embodiment of a humane reason, a man who had kept his clarity and his decency intact when almost everything around him had rotted, and she said so plainly, in public and in private. She worked to carry his thought into the English-speaking world, to translate his spirit, if not always his exact words for readers who had never heard his name, championing him at a time when his rivals drew far more attention, and his thinking flowed into hers in ways she never hid. Her conviction that human beings exist in the plural, that we are not one repeated specimen but a world of distinct persons who appear to one another, owes much to him. So does her belief that freedom lives in the space between people, in speech and action shared in public, rather than in some private inwardness. The communication that he had made the centre of his philosophy became, in her hands, a politics, a vision of a common world held in being by people willing to face one another and speak. The friendship was tested. Late in her life, Arendt became one of the most controversial thinkers alive, attacked from many sides, accused of coldness, and worse for what she wrote about the trial of a Nazi official and about the conduct of her own people under persecution. Old friends turned from her, doors that had stood open for decades quietly closed. Through all of it, Jaspers stood by her. He did not always agree, and he told her so, for that was the nature of the bond between them, but he never withdrew his trust or his love. He defended her judgment and her right to make it. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that a mind willing to think for itself would sometimes wound the very people it most wished to honour, and that this was the price of thinking and not a betrayal of it. The friendship held firm through the storm, as it had held through exile and war. She was with him in spirit to the end, and when he died, she wrote of him as a man who had shown what reason could be when it was joined to goodness, a person in whom thought and life had become one thing. He had given her, when she was very young, the example of a teacher who took a student's mind with complete seriousness. She had given him, across the long second half of his life, the gift of being fully understood by another human being. Between them they had proved, in the only way such things can be proved, in a lived relation rather than an argument, that the open and trusting encounter he placed at the heart of his philosophy was not a hope, but a fact. It had happened. It had lasted more than 40 years, and it had held. From about 1948 onward, in the quiet of his later years, Jaspers gave a name to the thing that had been moving under all his work, and he called it philosophical faith. The phrase is easy to mishear. It does not mean a private religion assembled by a professor, nor a thin substitute for belief, a set of opinions held loosely by a man who could no longer manage the real thing. It means something more demanding and more strange. It means that reason, at the very edge of what it can establish, does not fall silent and does not collapse into despair, but instead trusts. Faith, in this sense, is the trust that reason itself places in transcendence. It is an openness to the ground of being that asks for no creed, demands no assent to any reported miracle, and rests on no authority that could hand it to you finished. It is faith without dogma. Consider how unusual a position this is, because it refuses the two comforts that are normally offered. On one side stands the believer who is certain, who holds that one revelation, given once in one place to one people, contains the whole truth for all of humankind, and that everything outside it is error. On the other side stands the denier who is equally certain, who holds that the whole question is closed, that there is nothing beyond what can be measured and proven, and that to reach past the visible is only weakness dressed as longing. Jaspers found both of these to be the same gesture made in opposite directions. Each one shuts a door that honesty must leave open. The dogmatic religion absolutizes a single historical form and calls it the only door. The dogmatic denial bricks the doorway over and insists there was never a room beyond. Philosophical faith refuses to do either. It will not close the question from above with a creed, and it will not close it from below with a flat refusal to ask. What it does instead is stay open to every historical shape that faith has ever taken, without surrendering itself to any one of them. The prophets of Israel, the silence of the Buddha, the figure of Christ, the old myths of every people, all of these Jaspers treats as real bearers of truth, as genuine windows that human beings have opened onto what exceeds them. But a window is not the sky. To mistake one window for the whole of the light, to say that through this frame and no other can the light be seen, is precisely the error he wanted to refuse. No single revelation he held can rightly claim to hold the entire truth for everyone who has ever lived or ever will. The forms are many because the human situation is many, scattered across ages and languages, and the one transcendence shows itself differently to each. To honor that variety is not to drift into a lazy tolerance that believes in nothing. It is to take seriously that the ground of being is larger than any of the vessels we have made to carry word of it. This is where his long and courteous argument with the theologian Rudolf Bultmann belongs, an argument carried on between two serious men who respected each other and disagreed almost completely. Bultmann looked at the scriptures, at the rising and the descending, the voices from heaven, the bodies that would not stay dead, and he saw a problem for the modern person, who can no longer take such pictures as reports of fact. His solution was to strip the old stories away, to pull off the mythic husk so that a clear modern message might be recovered underneath, a message a thinking person of the 20th century could actually hold. Clear the myths, he urged, and find the meaning beneath them. Jaspers answered that this misunderstood entirely what the myths are. The myths are not a husk laid over a kernel. The myths are ciphers, and a cipher, as we have seen, is not a coded statement waiting to be solved and discarded once solved. To treat the old stories as superstition to be cleared away is to throw out the very thing that carried the meaning, for the meaning lived nowhere else but in the image. Yet to do the opposite, to freeze the story into literal fact, To insist that it happened just so in ordinary time and space was for Jaspers an error of the same kind, a different way of killing the cipher by pinning it down. The myths are neither to be demolished as falsehoods nor hardened into history. They are to be kept and read and pondered, held open as the signs they are, so that through them transcendence can go on speaking. Bultmann wished to remove them in order to save the message. Jaspers wished to preserve them because they are the message, or rather, because they are the only form in which that message can reach us at all. You can hear behind the technical dispute the whole shape of his thought. He is guarding a particular space, narrow and hard to keep, between two walls that are forever closing in on it. On one wall is secure knowledge, the realm of what can be proven and counted, which is vast and indispensable, and yet says nothing about the ground of our existence. On the other wall is closed dogma, the realm of the creed that claims to know what cannot be known and slams the matter shut. Between them lies the thin clearing where a human being can stand honestly in relation to what is greater than themselves, neither pretending to possess it nor pretending it is not there. The task of philosophical faith is simply to keep that clearing open, not to fill it with answers, to keep it open. And there is something fitting in the fact that a man so alert to the many forms of faith, so unwilling to crown any single one as the only true revelation, should have spent his last decades drawn toward the great religious awakenings of the human past. For if no one revelation holds the whole, then the whole must be sought across the many, in the recurring moments when human beings, far apart and unknown to one another, have turned their faces toward the same uncomprehended ground. He had come to believe that such moments were not scattered at random through history. He thought he could see, at one particular turning of the ages, a single vast awakening of the human spirit, breaking out at once in lands that had never heard each other's names. There is a fact about the history of the human spirit so strange that, once you have seen it, you can never quite stop seeing it. In several great lands that had barely heard of one another, lands divided by mountains and deserts and oceans, by languages no traveller could carry between them, the human mind seems to have awakened at almost the same hour, not at the same place, not through any shared teacher or messenger. And yet within a few centuries, gathered loosely around the year 500 before the Common Era, in China and in India, in Persia and in the land of Israel and in Greece, men began to think in a wholly new way. They began to ask the deepest questions about being and meaning and the good. And they asked them, as far as we can tell, without knowing that anyone else, anywhere, was asking them too. This is the idea Karl Jaspers placed at the centre of the book he published in 1949, The Origin and Goal of History. He gave the period a name. He called it the axis of history, the age on which the whole turning of the human story seems to rest. He set its broad span across the centuries from roughly 800 to 200 before the Common Era, with its bright middle around the year 500. And what he proposed was not a small claim about a few clever teachers. It was a claim about the shape of all of history and about who we are beneath the traditions that divide us. Consider what was happening separately in each of those lands. In China, Confucius walked the roads between the warring states, teaching a way of conduct and a reverence for the order of human life, while the teachers of the way, the quiet masters who wrote of the path that cannot be named, set down their own deep wisdom in the same generations. In India, the Buddha sat beneath his tree and broke open the question of suffering at its root, while the seers of the ancient scriptures, the hidden teachings whispered from master to pupil in the forest, turned inward to ask what the self finally is and what stands behind the visible world. In Persia, Zoroaster cast the whole of existence as a struggle between light and darkness, between truth and the lie, and laid upon each person the burden of choosing a side. In the small land of Israel, the Hebrew prophets rose against kings and crowds alike, crying out for justice and for a righteousness that no power on earth could buy, hearing in conscience a voice higher than the state. And in Greece, the philosophers began, from the first thinkers who asked what the world is made of, down through the long line that reaches Plato, to subject everything, the gods, the city, the soul, the very nature of knowing, to the clear and restless light of reason. These movements knew almost nothing of each other. The Greek did not read the prophet had never heard the Buddha's name. Confucius and Zoroaster shared no road and no script. And this is precisely what makes the pattern so arresting. 5 separate awakenings, in 5 separated worlds, all within a handful of centuries, all bending in the same direction. It is as though the human race, scattered and unable to speak across its distances, had nonetheless come of age all at once. What did these awakenings share beneath their enormous differences of climate and language and creed? Jaspers answered with care, and his answer is worth holding slowly. In each of them, for what seems the first time, human beings stepped back from sheer immersion in existence. Until then, one might say, men had lived inside their world the way a fish lives inside water, wholly surrounded by it, never apart from it, never able to see it from any distance. Custom and myth and the cycle of the seasons held them, and they did not stand outside that holding to question it. Then, in the axial centuries, something opened. Human beings became conscious of themselves as selves. They became conscious of the limits of their world and of their own smallness against the vastness of being. And from that strange new distance, they began to ask the radical questions, the unsettling ones that have never since been laid to rest. What is real beneath the changing show of things? What is a good life, and how should one live it? What may I hope for, and what am I? And what is the ground of everything that is? With these questions came 2 discoveries that have shaped every civilization since. The first was the individual conscience, the single person standing alone before the truth, answerable in the depths of the self, and not merely answerable to the tribe. The prophet defying the crowd, the philosopher following the argument wherever it led, the seeker leaving home to sit in silence, each was a person who had found within himself a court higher than the customs around him. The second discovery was the idea of the universal, of that which holds not for my people only, but for all people, the one reason, the one justice, the one truth that does not change when you cross a border. In each of these civilizations, in its own tongue and through its own images, the human mind reached past the local and the tribal towards something meant for everyone. Here is where Jaspers drew his deepest meaning from the pattern, and where the dry chronology becomes something close to a vision. If the decisive awakening of the human spirit happened independently, in lands that could not have borrowed it from one another, then humanity has a common spiritual origin. Not one source in one place, not a single chosen valley from which all light flowed outward, but a single transformation breaking out at once across the separated earth, as though it answered to something in the human creature as such. There is an axis, then, on which the whole of history seems to turn, and it does not pass through any one people. It passes through all of them together. This was, for Jaspers, a quiet and far-reaching correction, for he saw that every great tradition is tempted to place itself at the single centre of the human story, to say that here, and here alone, the truth entered the world, and that all other peoples stand in the outer dark until they turn toward this one light. The axial vision undercuts that claim at its root. It does not say the traditions are all the same. He was far too careful for so cheap a piece. It says that the breakthrough into genuine humanity happened in more than one place, that no single revelation owns the origin, and that the others are not latecomers begging at one door, but fellow originators, each having touched the depths in its own way. To grasp this is to be freed from the narrowness that takes one's own inheritance for the whole of the truth, and freed at the same time into a kind of reverence for the others who reach the same heights by paths one has never walked. We should remember when he wrote this. The book came in 1949, 4 years after a war that had very nearly ended in his own death, in a Europe of rubble and division, on a planet that had just learned to split the atom and so to imagine its own ending. Into that broken hour, Jaspers offered the axial age, not as a piece of antiquarian curiosity, but as the ground of a possible unity. If humanity shares an origin, then humanity is, in some real sense, one, beneath all the walls it has built. He was not naive about those walls. He knew the traditions could not simply be melted into one another, and his thought about faith without dogma, and about the many faiths that must learn to speak across their differences, belongs to another part of his work and another hour of this story. But the axial vision gave that hope a foundation in fact. It said that the unity of mankind is not merely a wish laid over a violent past. It is written into the very dawn of human thought, into the strange morning when the spirit awoke in many lands at once. There is something consoling in the picture, and something humbling. Consoling because it tells us that the great questions are not the property of any sect or century, that they rose everywhere the human heart grew deep enough to ask them, and that to ask them now is to join a conversation as old and as wide as civilization itself. Humbling because it sets each of us and each of our certainties inside a far larger company than we knew. The seer in the forest, the prophet in the city, the philosopher in the marketplace, the master on the road, none of them could see the others, and yet they were, without knowing it, awakening together. Across all the distance that kept them apart, they were turning, each in the dark of his own land, toward the same dawning light. Jaspers tried in his last great labour to write a history of philosophy unlike any other. Not a procession of dates and schools, not a march of doctrines correcting one another down the centuries, but an order built around the few human beings who set the measure for all the rest. The book appeared in 1957 under the title The Great Philosophers, and it was meant to be only the first part of something vast, a world history of thought that he never finished. What he completed is enough to show the audacity of the design. He proposed to arrange the thinkers of every age and every civilization, not by when they lived, but by what kind of figures they were, by the human type each one embodied. Chronology fell away. In its place stood a gallery of kinds of greatness. The boldest grouping comes first, and it is the one that gives the whole project its centre. Jaspers called them the measure-giving individuals, the people who set the standard by which we afterward judge what a deep human life can be. There are 4 of them: Socrates in Athens, the Buddha in northern India, Confucius in China, and Jesus in Galilee. He placed them together at the head of the entire history, before the system builders, before the great metaphysicians, before anyone who left a finished doctrine behind. They come first because, in his judgment, they reach deepest, and they reach deepest precisely because they founded no system at all. Consider what these 4 did not do. None of them wrote a treatise. None of them left a body of conclusions to be memorized and passed down. 2 of them, Socrates and Jesus, left, so far as we know, not a single written line of their own. Everything we have of them comes through others, through pupils and witnesses who remembered and recorded. They built no schools of thought in the ordinary sense, proved no theorems, issued no list of results that a later reader could check off and possess. And yet Jaspers ranks them above the men who did all of those things. Their power, he argues, lies somewhere else entirely. It lies in the example of a life and in a way of questioning, not in any store of answers. This is the heart of the matter, and it is worth holding still for a moment. We are used to measuring a philosopher by what he concluded, by the structure he left standing. But Socrates leaves no structure. He leaves a manner, the relentless, courteous, unsettling question that takes nothing for granted and lets no comfortable certainty stand unexamined. The Buddha leaves a path and a bearing toward existence, a way of meeting suffering more than a metaphysics to be defended. Confucius leaves an example of how a human being conducts himself among others, what it looks like to live rightly within the order of family and state. Jesus leaves a presence and a demand that no doctrine ever quite contains. In each case, the teaching is inseparable from the person teaching it. You cannot extract the result and discard the life, because the life is the result. They opened philosophy's deepest possibilities simply by how they lived and how they questioned, and this is a different kind of greatness than the kind that writes a finished book. That these four arose in separated civilizations around the same stretch of centuries belongs to the larger pattern Jaspers had already named the axial age, the near-simultaneous awakening of the human spirit across worlds that knew nothing of one another. Here he does something further with that pattern. He sets the four side by side, not to blend them, not to pretend they taught the same thing, for they plainly did not, but to let each stand in its full distinctness while sharing the same rank. The point is not that they agree. The point is that each, in his own tongue and his own country, struck a depth that the rest of us still measure ourselves against. Behind the whole book lies a vision larger than any one of its portraits. Jaspers believed that the great thinkers of every age and every culture form one long conversation, a single exchange carried on across the millennia. Socrates and the Buddha, and Confucius and Jesus, and after them the system builders and the seekers and the questioners of every land, are not relics behind glass in a museum of dead opinions. They are living partners in thought, and we are to meet them as such. To read them well is to enter the conversation, to answer them and be answered, to let them press their questions on us as if they sat in the room. The philosopher recalled here, who had once found in Kierkegaard and Nietzsche the two awakeners who roused his own century, now extended that same intimacy backward across all of recorded thought. And so the deepest claim of the book is also its quietest. Philosophy, on this view, is not the property of one tradition. It is not a possession of Greece or of the West, or of any single line of inheritance. It is the common birthright of all humanity, opened wherever human beings have questioned seriously enough about how to live and what is real. Athens and India and China and Galilee belong to one estate. The history of philosophy, rightly written, is not a national archive. It is the record of a conversation the whole human race has been having with itself, and which is not yet over, and into which each of us is invited. In 1948, at the age of 65, Karl Jaspers left Germany. He accepted a chair at the University of Basel, across the border in Switzerland, and he never moved back. The reasons were not only practical. He had survived the worst years inside Germany, and he had hoped, after the liberation, that his country would undertake the hard inner reckoning he believed it owed. He was disappointed. The reckoning he wanted, the kind he had set out in his short post-war book on German guilt, seemed to him to be quietly avoided, deferred, allowed to fade under the noise of recovery. He wanted freer air. Basel gave it to him. There, in a quiet house with Gertrude, he spent the last 2 decades of his life, writing steadily, watching Germany from a small distance that let him see it more clearly and judge it more sharply. It was from this late vantage that he became, for the first time, a genuinely public philosopher. The young man, once given barely a decade to live, had husbanded every breath and done his thinking in the stillness of a quiet room, his influence travelling outward almost entirely on paper. Now, an old man across a border, that frail and private scholar turned to the radio and found that his voice could carry to a whole nation at once. A series of broadcast talks, plain and unhurried, became the little book translated into English as Way to Wisdom, published in 1950. It is the most widely read thing he ever wrote and the most loved. In 100 quiet pages it asks what philosophy is, where it begins, what it is for, and it answers without a single technical term standing between the reader and the question. It reached people who would never enter a university lecture hall. For many of them, it was the first time anyone had suggested that the largest questions were theirs to ask, that wonder and grief and the fear of death were already the beginning of thinking. The author of vast and demanding works had discovered that he could also be simple, and that simplicity, rightly earned, was its own kind of depth. The broadcasts were only the start. Across the 2 Basel decades, he spoke into the public quarrels of the day, on the air and in the press, and his voice carried a weight that surprised even him. He had stayed clean through the worst years and owed nothing to the powers he now criticised, and that gave his judgment an authority no office could confer. Letters came from across Europe, from the young and the troubled and the famous, and from strangers who felt addressed by a few pages, and he had become, late and almost against his nature, a public conscience for the whole German-speaking world. Then came the bomb. In 1958, Jaspers published The Atom Bomb and the Future of Man, and it is the most urgent book of his old age. Its central claim is stark and, he insisted, genuinely new. For the whole of human history, catastrophe had been local. Cities fell, plagues passed, empires burned, and the species went on. The atom bomb ended that. For the first time, human beings had acquired the power to erase themselves entirely, to bring the whole human story to a close by their own hand. This, Jaspers argued, was not one more political problem among others. It was an absolutely new condition, a threshold the species had crossed and could not step back from. And because it was new, no merely clever response would answer it. Better treaties, shrewder diplomacy, a steadier balance of fear, these might buy time, but they could not meet the thing itself. He pressed the point to its hard edge. The knowledge could not be unlearned. What human beings had once worked out they would know forever, within reach of anyone who willed it, and so there was no technical exit. The danger no longer lived in any machine but in the people who held the knowledge, and they were the only thing left that could still change. What the bomb demanded, he said, was a transformation of the whole way human beings think and live. It called for a new seriousness, a turning of the inner person, even a willingness to sacrifice, the readiness to risk and to give up much rather than purchase survival at the price of everything that made survival worth having. He refused to let the threat be understood as a single danger. The bomb, the outer power to destroy all life, was for him only one face of the crisis of the age. The other face was inner and political. He saw, in the total domination practiced by the great tyrannies of the century, a second way the human being could be annihilated, not by fire, but by the extinction of freedom, the reduction of persons to functions of a machine that thinks for them. To survive the bomb by surrendering to total control would be no rescue at all. The two threats, he argued, were not separate emergencies. They were two faces of one condition, and they had to be thought together. Bare survival was not the goal. The goal was a humanity that kept both its existence and its freedom, and that could lose neither without losing itself. Here the old theme of reason set against fanaticism returned, now stretched to the scale of the whole species. He did not spare his own country. In 1966, at 83, he published The Future of Germany, and it was the most controversial book of his life. The young West German democracy, he warned, was failing the test he most cared about. It had not confronted its past with the honesty that past required, and it was drifting, comfortable and complacent, toward a settled rule of entrenched parties that managed the state among themselves while the citizen looked on. He saw the forms of freedom preserved and the substance quietly hollowing. The reaction was fierce. He was called a pessimist, an old man embittered by exile, even disloyal to the country he had judged from the safety of Switzerland. Around this time he took Swiss citizenship, and to many that gesture seemed to confirm the charge. He bore the accusations as he had borne others, certain that the deepest loyalty a thinker owes a nation is to tell it the truth it would rather not hear. He died in Basel in 1969, a few weeks past his 86th birthday. There is a quiet arithmetic in that date worth pausing over. The boy whose youthful prognosis had promised him so little had lived into deep old age, had outlasted 2 world wars, and the regime that tried to erase him had written for more than half a century and had been, at the very end, still arguing with his country about how it ought to live. The frail life given barely a decade had stretched across the whole of a terrible century and reached its far shore. He had used every year of it. Here is a puzzle worth holding in the mind. By almost any serious measure, Karl Jaspers was one of the great philosophers of the 20th century. He helped found a whole discipline of psychiatry. He wrote one of the largest and most patient bodies of philosophical work that century produced, and he thought with clarity about the deepest questions a person can ask. And yet today, he is read far less than several of his contemporaries, less than Heidegger, far less than the French existentialists who filled the cafes of Paris and the pages of the magazines. A thinker of this stature should not be a footnote. The strange thing is that he very nearly became one. To understand his legacy, we have to begin with that neglect, and then watch how quietly, over the decades, it has begun to reverse. The reasons for the neglect are not mysterious, and most of them are to his credit. He founded no school. He gathered no disciples around him, trained no movement to carry his name forward like a banner, left behind no circle of followers who would defend his system and attack his critics. He had no system to defend. He wrote against systems on principle, and a man who refuses to build a fortress leaves nothing for an army to occupy. He coined no memorable slogans. The phrases that travel fastest through a culture are the sharp ones, the ones that fit on a poster or a paperback cover, and Jaspers distrusted exactly that kind of phrase because a slogan closes a question that he wanted to keep open. His prose offered nothing to quote on a banner. It is patient, undramatic, almost translucent, the prose of a man thinking slowly in a quiet room rather than a man performing brilliance for an audience. You cannot easily lift a glittering sentence out of it, because the meaning lives in the long unfolding rather than in the single line. And he was overshadowed. The century rewarded the dramatic and the notorious, and Jaspers was neither. Heidegger had the deeper notoriety, and for a long time the deeper fascination, in part because of the very compromise that ought to have buried him. The French existentialists had the glamour of a movement, the novels and the plays and the politics, the sense of a philosophy you could live out loud in public. Beside all of that, a frail professor writing 1,000-page works about reason and communication, a man whose central commitment was to stay open and to never overstate, simply did not catch the light. Fame in philosophy often goes to the thinker who makes the boldest single gesture. Jaspers made no single gesture. He made a lifetime of careful ones, and careful work is the slowest kind to be noticed. But noticed it has been, and the noticing has grown. His standing has risen, not in a sudden fashion, not through any revival movement with manifestos, but in the steady way that solid work outlasts brilliant noise. Consider the idea of the axial age. When he first proposed it, it might have looked like the speculation of a philosopher reaching beyond his evidence. it has become instead one of the genuinely productive ideas in the comparative study of civilizations and of religion. Sociologists and historians of religion took it up, argued over it, tested it, extended it. The scholar Robert Bellah, among others, built substantial work on its foundation. Whether one finally accepts the thesis or rejects it, one has to reckon with it, and a concept that scholars cannot stop arguing about is a concept that has earned its place. That a philosopher gave the field one of its organizing ideas is no small inheritance. His founding work in psychiatry has had an even quieter and more durable afterlife. It is simply part of the bedrock of the discipline now, so deeply absorbed that those who rely on it often no longer know whose work they are standing on. The distinction at its heart, his separation of understanding from explaining, remains a living tool in the description of the human mind. There is a particular kind of immortality in becoming anonymous in this way, in having your insight pass so completely into common practice that it no longer needs your name attached. Most thinkers would envy it. His analysis of German guilt has had a different fate, and a striking one. Written for a defeated and shattered nation, it might have stayed a document of its single grim moment. Instead, it became a touchstone, reached for again and again wherever a people has tried to look honestly at crimes committed in its own name. His sorting of German guilt has outlived the particular rubble it was written among, because the problem it addressed did not stay in that rubble. Nations keep having to reckon with their own pasts, and when they try to do it with honesty rather than evasion, they find that Jaspers was there before them, having already thought through the distinctions they need. And there is Hannah Arendt. Through her, perhaps more than through any book of his own, his spirit entered the heart of modern political thought. The friendship between them was not a matter of a teacher handing down doctrine to a pupil. It was the very thing he prized most, two free minds thinking together without either surrendering. What she carried forward was less a set of positions than a way of holding oneself toward the world, a refusal of cant, an insistence on thinking for oneself in the open. That his influence runs so strongly through a thinker who was nobody's disciple, least of all his, is exactly the kind of legacy he would have wanted. He never wanted followers. He wanted partners in thought, and in her he had one. Then there is the deepest reason of all that he reads as urgently contemporary, and it has nothing to do with any single doctrine. It is his whole stance. His commitment to philosophy as openness, to communication between persons as the place where truth actually lives, to reason as a bond rather than a weapon, and his lifelong warning against every fanatical certainty, against the closed mind that has stopped listening because it believes it already knows. He lived in an age of hardened ideologies, and he saw what they did. We live in another such age, in which minds close like fists around their convictions, and the willingness to be answered, to be changed by another person, comes to seem like weakness rather than strength. To a time like that, Jaspers speaks with a force he may not have had even in his own. He is the philosopher of the open, and the open is exactly what such a time most lacks. So we return, at the very end, to the man. He lived under two death sentences, the one passed over his lungs in his youth, and the one that hung over him and his wife at the close of the war. A man might have answered such a life with despair, or with the brittle hardness of someone who has decided that nothing can be trusted and nothing can be shared. He answered with the opposite. He answered with reason, with communication, with the steady refusal ever to close his mind, even against the people and the regime that had every intention of closing it for him permanently. What remains when the doctrines are set aside is a single image. He could have made a fortress of his thought, a system to hide inside, a doctrine to defend against all comers, and the world would have remembered him more loudly for it. He did the harder and the rarer thing. He built everything he made to stay open. The work has no walls, No final word, no closed door, because he believed that the moment a mind closes, it stops being a mind and becomes a weapon. He kept his open against illness, against terror, against the temptation of certainty, all the way to the end. And it is open still, waiting, the way an unfinished conversation waits, for whoever is willing to sit down across from it and think.